Hi everyone, this is the Framingham case study summary interpretation presentation by the leader Achu. The reason for the Framingham case study was because of the prevalence of cardiovascular disease, which was the highest cause of death in the United States. So one of the reasons why the Framingham study was created was to understand the reasons for the disease and understand the risk factors that affect or that contribute to the promotion of the disease. So again, it was an observational study where data was collected from a lot of participants. According to the work that we had, the spreadsheet that was provided for the class, it said there was a total of 11,630 and 27 observations that were made, and the amount of participants that were there were 4,434 participants. So the possible factors that were observed or that were done to analyze this included age, sex, blood pressure, state of diabetes, smoking status if the member was a smoker versus a non-smoker, and then this observation or this risk factors were observed over a period of time, and then they were analyzed to see, kind of get a trend to see exactly which factor or which participant had an increase in the factor and which one finally developed cardiovascular disease. The interpretation again is just a continuation. What we did was we wanted to know if men versus women were more prevalent to develop cardiovascular disease in the long run. So what we did was there was a sample size of 4,434 participants. That was 1944 men and 2490 females. And what happened during this time was we analyzed it by sorting all the data sets to gender to see if there was maybe, if women were more prevalent to developing the disease later on versus men. So when we did the analysis, the averages of the characteristics were taken for both men and women, like I initially said. The average age for the men was 49, and for females was 50. Well, women seem to have higher values for factors than men. Maybe it was because, as women having babies, sometimes you develop blood pressure, higher blood pressure, or you take up the family. So other factors of the stress could have contributed for women having a higher values than the men. But even though the differences were very small, so I came to the conclusion that gender really was not the only determining factor for anybody to develop cardiovascular disease. And then another thing that we did was we tried to analyze. So the first one that we did was try to sort it by gender. So the next one that we did was using BMI, that's body mass index, to see if those with a higher body mass index were more at risk for developing cardiovascular disease. So the average age for all the participants when I did the analysis was 25, which indicates that most of the participants were overweight. We used BMI as a dependent variable to compare using regression analysis. And so what happens is when we did the analysis, we realized that there was BMI compared against all the other factors such as age, sex, blood pressure, diabetes status, if the participants were smokers versus non-smokers. We realized that most of the people, so from the analysis, I was able to realize that most of the people from the analysis, I realized that participants with higher body mass index. We're most likely to have higher values in blood pressure. We're most likely to be smokers. We're most likely to have diabetes. So I kind of saw some kind of correlation between both, because the higher BMI you have, kind of like the higher weight you have. So that means you don't work, you don't exercise, you probably don't eat right. So you are at a higher risk for developing cardiovascular disease versus somebody with a lower body mass index. And then the next thing that we did was we used the prevalence for coronary heart disease to just see if, that was a determining factor for people who had a history of coronary heart disease to later on have a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So what we did was we analyzed it. We separated the data into those who had a history of coronary heart disease versus those who didn't. And then we used age for those who had. We used systolic blood pressure. So these are the characteristics that we used. Age, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, total serum cholesterol, and body mass index. So if you look at the data set here, for ages, that was kind of like the average, and here's like the significance. So if you look at the data you would see that those with a history of coronary heart disease had higher values as compared to those who didn't have a history of coronary heart disease. So what that means is, those with the history of coronary heart disease have a higher risk of later on developing cardiovascular disease. And here is an interpretation of the data collection method. So data collection is just a process of gathering information to be able to answer a question. In this case, the data was collected to be able to determine what were the factors or the characteristics that became risk factors, or what were some of those factors that could determine cardiovascular disease. So the data was collected using quantitative, qualitative surveys were collected, observations, documentation, and patient history. So all this information was then collected and observed over a period of time, about 6 years. Well, I read somewhere that the observation is still going on. So they have moved from the original participants, and now they are like in the second or the third generation, just to see if having a history maybe from your parents or having a history of the disease inherited could also cause you to have to develop cardiovascular disease in the long run. And then other practices that I thought maybe they could do was, from the data that I read, I realized that most of the participants were Caucasian, and so I think maybe in order to avoid some kind of bias, because the race in which you're from kind of could determine a lot of, how you grew up versus, the things that you face and the prevalence of diseases. So I'm having a study that involves all races versus just one race, and trying to use that data from one race to apply to everybody. Having a study that includes all races and all genders.